Lieutenant Commander Logan Mad Dog Walker gripped the wheel of PT-221 so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Japanese searchlights swept across the pitch-black Pacific, slicing the waves with beams of hard light as they hunted for the American patrol boats that had been harassing their supply lines for weeks. What Admiral Hiroshi Yamamoto and his destroyer captains did not yet realize was that these small wooden boats they were so eager to obliterate were carrying something entirely new, something that could shift the balance of power in the Pacific overnight. But before we get into what happened that night, take a second, if you're listening. Tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this tale gets your heart racing, hit that follow button. You won't want to miss what's coming tomorrow. Now, back to that moonless October night. What looked like a typical patrol boat from afar was anything but. Hidden within a dozen experimental torpedo boats, all launched from the newly built base on Crescent Island, was a weapon no one expected. A 40mm anti-aircraft cannon, typically mounted on battleships or cruisers. It had been retrofitted, concealed, and made seaworthy for a daring new mission. The Japanese fleet thought they were chasing prey, but they were actually stalking wolves dressed as sheep. Engines on PT-221 hummed on low throttle as Walker peered through his binoculars. 3 Japanese destroyers cruised in a tight formation about half a mile off, moving like confident predators, unaware that the Americans had turned the tables. Down below, in the bowels of the ship, Petty Officer First Class Ricardo Vasquez, the boat's senior mechanic, wiped his grease-covered hands and eyed the disguised weapon system they had spent the last 6 hours preparing. 6 months earlier, the idea of arming wooden patrol boats with ship-grade firepower would have been laughed out of any Navy room. But that all changed after a certain meeting in Mobile, Alabama, inside the drafting office of the Henderson Marine Works, one of the top military shipbuilders of the time. The plant's founder, Russell Henderson, a cranky genius with a pipe in his teeth and no tolerance for red tape, had been approached by a Navy engineering officer named Commander Matthew Briggs. Briggs was a soft-spoken man with calloused hands and the intense sunken eyes of someone who had seen too many funerals held at sea. He carried with him a folder packed with reports, after-action summaries from the Solomon Islands campaign that painted a grim picture. While American PT boats were fast and lethal against enemy transports, they were practically defenseless when destroyers or cruisers joined the fight. Their .50 caliber guns and 20mm cannons could damage radar masks or take out a few men on deck, but against a destroyer's armor, they may as well have been throwing pebbles. Too many brave crews had been lost, trying to outrun cannon fire with nothing but speed and prayers. The solution came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Natalie Reynolds, one of the first female combat systems engineers, had been poring over intercepted Japanese after-action reports in a repurposed warehouse in San Diego, working late nights surrounded by schematics, half-empty coffee mugs, and the constant drone of ceiling fans. What Reynolds noticed was something no one else had picked on to. Japanese destroyer captains repeatedly described PT boat attacks as mosquito bites, annoying enough to disrupt convoy operations, but not serious enough to deter them. The assumption across the Imperial Navy was that PT boats were lightly armed and used only for hit-and-run torpedo attacks. They got close because the enemy assumed they posed no real threat once they had fired their torpedoes. What Reynolds realized, that assumption created a tactical blind spot, an opening. If the PT boats could carry heavier firepower without looking like they did, they could catch a destroyer completely off guard and potentially blow it out of the water from close range. There were challenges, of course, big ones. The Swedish-designed 40mm Bofors cannon they considered weighed nearly 6,000 pounds and generated enormous recoil that could shatter the frame of a typical PT boat. Ammunition storage alone would reduce torpedo capacity, and secrecy was paramount.
Any indication that these boats carried more than standard armament would blow the entire operation before it even started. Henderson, stubborn and obsessed with engineering challenges, took it as a personal mission. Inside a heavily guarded section of his shipyard, he and his team built what they called the Phantom gun mount. The system was ingenious. The cannon sat on a custom-built hydraulic lift that could raise it from a concealed compartment in under 60 seconds. When stowed, the deck platform was covered with deck plating so seamless that it was virtually invisible even to aerial reconnaissance. Ammunition stores were hidden within fuel compartments and secured behind fake bulkheads that blended perfectly with the rest of the interior. Handling the recoil was another issue. Henderson's crew redesigned the boat's frame, integrating a latticework of steel reinforcement bars under the deck to spread the gun's shockwave throughout the entire hull. The added weight only increased the boat's displacement by about 1,800 pounds, just enough to be noticeable on paper, but not enough to affect performance in the field. By August, 12 boats had been outfitted, tested under extreme conditions, and shipped to Crescent Island, a hush-hush naval outpost roughly 50 miles from the nearest Japanese patrol route. And now, here they were, midnight, October 9th, waiting for the perfect moment. As the lead destroyer, a Japanese ship identified later as the Kuroshima, drifted within 600 yards of PT-221, Walker gave the order. "Pop the lid," he muttered into his throat mic. Within moments, the deck creaked, hydraulics hissed, and the disguised Bofors cannon began to rise into view. Ricardo Vasquez, now at the gun's loading hatch, cracked his knuckles and called out, "Ready when you are, skipper." Logan Walker adjusted his grip on the wheel, watching the unsuspecting destroyer drift just a little closer. Let's give 'em something they won't forget. And with that, PT-221, one of the deadliest secrets of the Pacific Theater, roared to life.
To preserve the speed edge that had long been the trademark of their class, the engineers at Henderson Marine Works went back to the drawing board. They upgraded the engines and completely redesigned the propeller system, squeezing out even better performance than the Navy had expected. These new PT boats, though loaded with heavy firepower, could still move like water bugs, and sometimes just as unpredictably. Testing took place far from prying eyes, in the brackish waters of Lake Hamilton, under a blanket of top-level secrecy. Navy pilots flying overhead had been briefed that what they were seeing below were simply trial runs for new torpedo systems. The real story was known to only a handful of people. Night after night, the boats ran live fire exercises using specially modified ammunition that produced minimal muzzle flash. Even the gunners were hand-picked volunteers, each of them signing an extra thick stack of non-disclosure agreements and going through background checks so thorough they made some wonder if they were joining the CIA rather than the Navy. Commander Matthew Briggs oversaw the testing himself. The man was tireless. He would routinely spend 18-hour days on the boats, sweating through drills, fine-tuning firing methods, and tweaking combat tactics until everything felt just right. And the results? They were better than anyone dared hope. Hidden beneath the deck, that 40mm Bofors cannon could strike targets out to 4,000 yards, nearly 2.5 miles, with shocking precision. More importantly, the shock it delivered wasn't just from the shells themselves, but from the psychological impact. Time and again, Japanese destroyer captains who approached these boats thinking they were harmless found themselves suddenly staring down a thunderous barrage of shrapnel and smoke. They weren't hunting minnows. They had just poked a shark with a stick. The first production models, designated PT-215 through PT-226, rolled out of Henderson's New Orleans plant in late July of 1943. On paper, they were listed as standard Mark 8 torpedo boats, fitted with what were described as minor alterations. Only a few top-level commanders, including Admiral Charles Newman, had the full specs. Everyone else got a very vague rundown, or nothing at all. Not even the boat's skippers were told what they were dealing with until they arrived at the forward base. Tulagi Harbor, once just another Pacific fueling outpost, was now the invisible hub of Special Operations Development Group 73, a unit so classified that it didn't even officially exist on any Navy chart. These 12 mystery boats were said to be testing new sonar systems and advanced torpedo tech. In reality, they had one mission: to sneak up on Japanese surface ships and give them a taste of America's new playbook. Lieutenant Commander Logan Mad Dog Walker, already a legend in the theater for his fearless attacks during the Guadalcanal campaign, was reassigned to Tulagi. When he got the call, he expected another suicide run, maybe a moonlit dash at a fortified harbor, the kind of job with no return ticket. What he got instead changed everything. Waiting for him on the dock was Chief Boatswain William Tank Morrison, a silver-haired artillery vet who'd been patrolling the Pacific since before the war even started. Morrison wasn't there by accident. Known for his cool head and iron-tight lips, he'd been chosen specifically to brief new skippers without spilling more than necessary. Morrison gave Walker the tour aboard PT-221, and when he activated the hydraulic mount and raised the Bofors cannon from its hidden compartment, Walker understood instantly. This wasn't just another boat. This was a whole new kind of warship. The weapon itself was a marvel of Swedish design, refined and adapted by American hands to serve the Navy's bold new strategy. Each of its twin barrels could fire up to 120 rounds per minute, high-explosive fragmentation shells that could punch through a destroyer's outer skin and ruin its critical systems. A single well-aimed burst could disable communications, ignite fuel stores, or rip through exposed crew areas. The best part? That rate of fire allowed one humble wooden boat to mimic the sustained firepower of a destroyer's own anti-ship battery. In the right hands and with the right timing, it could hold the line or even turn the tide. But that firepower came with a steep cost. These crews would need to throw everything they knew about PT boat tactics out the window. No more quick strike and retreat. No more disappearing into the night. These missions would involve standing their ground, at least long enough to make their first hit count. That meant they needed new training, new nerves, and new doctrine. Walker's crew drilled every day for weeks, mastering what Morrison called the minute that matters. They practiced raising the gun under cover of darkness, acquiring a target in motion, and delivering a crippling first strike, all before the enemy realized what was happening. If they got it right, they would win the encounter. If they hesitated or missed, they'd be swimming home, if they were lucky. One of the biggest challenges wasn't technical, it was psychological. Most sailors assigned to PT boats knew they were riding floating plywood coffins. Their survival depended on being faster than the enemy and never being seen. But now they were expected to let Japanese destroyers get within 1,000 yards or less, deliberately holding back their torpedoes to draw the ships in close. At that distance, traditional tactics screamed suicide. But these weren't traditional boats anymore. It all came down to timing. The boats had to look like the same old soft targets until the very last second. Then, boom! The gun lifted, the target locked, and within seconds, a destroyer's bridge was shredded, its deck on fire, its crew in chaos. Those first 15 seconds were everything. After that, the enemy's main guns would come alive, and no armor in the world could save a boat made of plywood. Still, Walker's crew trained relentlessly. They rehearsed every movement until it was second nature. From the moment the gun lifted, it took less than 10 seconds to deliver the first salvo. That was their window. They also had to be ready for the aftermath. Japanese destroyers weren't known for retreating quietly. Once the illusion shattered, they would bring every cannon they had to bear. That's when Walker's team had to rely on speed, deception, and the oldest trick in the book: disappear before the smoke clears. Each mission was a ballet of risk and precision, and every man on board knew the margin of error was no thicker than the boat's wooden hull.
It took months of grinding, nerve-testing training before Walker's crew was ready to take a shot at the unthinkable: head-on combat with enemy destroyers. Unlike traditional PT boat strategy, which focused on speed and evasion, this new doctrine required something almost unnatural: staying exposed under heavy fire and fighting back. The gunners aboard PT-221, under Walker's command, had to build up the kind of confidence that doesn't come easy. They had to learn to stand in the open on a trembling deck, clutching hot steel while shells from destroyer batteries exploded all around them. They weren't just operating a weapon, they were the weapon. Their first taste of real combat came during a high-stakes enemy evacuation near Kolombangara Island in late August 1943. Intelligence had picked up chatter that Admiral Hiroshi Tanaka was running nighttime shuttles to pull Japanese troops off the island. His destroyers were covering the retreat, using their superior firepower to swat away American PT boats like flies. What the Japanese didn't know was that this time they weren't chasing bugs, they were being stalked by something with teeth. Tanaka's strategy had evolved to counter torpedo attacks. Japanese destroyers used powerful spotlights and overlapping fields of gunfire to suppress and destroy any boat that dared close the gap. American boats never got close enough to matter. But this time would be different. Walker's division, 4 of the Navy's new forward-gunned PT boats, was ordered to intercept the convoy on the night of August 27th. It was a test, a trial by fire. If they could catch the destroyers off guard and land a crippling blow, the entire secret weapons program would be validated. If they failed, well, the losses would be reported as standard PT boat casualties, and the Navy would bury the project quietly. Everything depended on surprise. Conditions were perfect. Thick clouds smothered the moonlight, leaving the sea dark but navigable. A gentle southeastern wind created just enough chop to blur the wakes without making the boats unstable. But the real edge, the weather grounded Japanese recon planes. With the skies out of play, the convoy had to rely on surface spotters alone. PT-221 led the formation, leaving Crescent Island just after sunset and heading northwest toward an intercept point estimated by naval intelligence. The other boats kept a disciplined spacing, 500 yards between each craft, no radios, just compass work and dead reckoning. Their guns were still hidden, tucked beneath purpose-built deck panels textured and painted to match the boat's weathered surface. From any angle, they looked like nothing more than old-school torpedo boats, exactly what the enemy expected. As they neared the intercept zone, Walker could make out the distant glow of fires burning on Kolombangara Island's western shore. Japanese demolition teams were torching supplies too heavy or too dangerous to bring back. The convoy ahead was expected to be loaded with men and equipment, which meant the destroyers would be heavy, slower to turn, and more focused on escape than engagement. And that was the opening. According to captured Japanese manuals, their primary objective during extractions was to avoid direct combat if at all possible. If the PT boats could stay invisible just a little longer, the trap would spring exactly as planned. Soon, one of the Japanese ships, the Hamikaze, a fast and heavily armed destroyer, picked them up on radar. The signal was faint, fluctuating with the sea, but it was enough to raise alarm. Captain Moto Katsumi, in charge of the escort group, immediately ordered full speed ahead and directed his ships to brace for a torpedo run. It was a logical call. According to all their doctrine, PT boats fired their torpedoes from 3,000 yards, then turned and ran at full speed while laying smoke. Their job was to disrupt, not destroy. So when the boats didn't behave that way, Katsumi hesitated. Instead of speeding up and turning away, Walker's boats slowed down. They kept closing the distance. From the bridge of the Hamikaze, Katsumi interpreted this as an error, maybe a steering failure or a power loss. No one in their right mind would bring a plywood boat within cannon range of a destroyer. But that's exactly what Walker was doing. On PT-221, Walker watched as Japanese spotlights suddenly snapped to life, cutting across the waves and locking on his formation. At 1,500 yards, well inside the danger zone, he gave the order. "Stand by," came the voice of Chief Morrison over the intercom. "Gun platform rising, target confirmed, range locked." The Bofors gun rumbled quietly beneath the deck as its hydraulic lift brought it into firing position. The sound was nearly lost in the roar of the engines, but to Walker, it was the thunderclap of fate. 30 seconds. That's how long they had before the Japanese realized they weren't dealing with regular PT boats. That's how long the Americans had to do something unforgettable. Morrison's voice cut through again. "We're up. Guns hot, target painted. 1,500 yards. Standing by." Walker exhaled slowly. This was it. The moment they'd trained for. The moment that would either prove the weapon's worth or end them blown to splinters. He clenched the intercom button. "Fire."
The next 60 seconds would determine everything. That single minute, ticking away under the thick black sky off Lavella Island, would either mark the beginning of a new chapter in naval warfare or a tragic end for 12 experimental boats and their crews. The Japanese destroyers were closing fast. They believed they were bearing down on a few outgunned torpedo boats, armed with nothing more than .50 caliber machine guns and maybe a few light cannons. They had no idea they were seconds away from stepping into a carefully laid American trap, one that would rewrite the rules of Pacific naval engagements. The 12 boats of Special Operations Group 73 were about to get their baptism of fire. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and by all conventional logic, doomed. But conventional logic had never accounted for 40mm Swedish cannons hidden inside plywood patrol boats. In the engine bay of PT-221, Petty Officer Ricardo Vasquez felt the shift immediately, the subtle drop in RPM as Walker's hand came off the throttle, signaling the transition from pursuit to firing mode. Above his head, steel pistons hissed, lifting the cannon into action. And up top, targets were moving into range, completely unaware that what they were about to face was something no destroyer captain had ever trained for. For months, the Japanese had operated under the assumption that PT boats were fragile, fast, and largely harmless, pesky at best, a minor annoyance during convoy duty. That belief was about to be shattered by a shell traveling over 200 feet per second. History, as they say, was about to be written in tracer rounds and high-explosive shrapnel. The first shot fired by PT-221's Bofors cannon struck the forward superstructure of the destroyer Hamikaze at precisely 21:39 hours. The explosion lit the night with a burst of orange flame, washing across the dark sea like a sunrise made of steel and fire. On the bridge of the Hamikaze, Captain Motoi Katsumi reeled as the blast tore through the bridge wing, instantly killing 3 spotters and showering the control deck with deadly fragments. For a moment, he just stood there, frozen, staring in disbelief at the origin of the incoming fire. There, bobbing on the waves like a fishing boat, was a tiny American craft, armed not with machine guns, but with ship-killing ordnance, delivering precise 40mm strikes like it had no business doing. Nothing in Katsumi's training, no doctrine, no war game, no manual had prepared him for this. Torpedo boats were never supposed to fire on destroyers. They were supposed to run, not stand their ground. And yet here he was, watching shell after shell slam into his ship's upper deck, each impact unleashing a cascade of sparks, smoke, and red-hot metal. This was impossible, but it was happening. And it was happening fast. Back on PT-221, Chief Morrison's gunnery crew operated with practiced discipline. Despite the chaos of the battlefield, their hands moved in perfect rhythm, loading and firing in sync. The twin-barreled Bofors hammered the night with a steady rhythm, spitting out high-explosive fragmentation rounds as fast as the loaders could feed them. Even Walker, who had seen every round fired during training back in Louisiana, was taken aback by the weapon's performance under live conditions. The autoloader fed rounds into the chamber at a speed that stunned the eye. Shells from Militis Ammunition Company cracked through the dark like thunder, each one slamming into the Hamikaze's deck with brutal efficiency. A few hundred yards behind, the second Japanese destroyer Yukikaze tried to bring its main guns to bear. But its targeting radar had been optimized for large warships at long distances, not small, agile boats at close range. The USPTs were darting across the sea like angry shadows. Every time a 5-inch shell hit the water, the boats were already somewhere else, twisting, zigzagging, playing with death and laughing while they did it. Captain Hiroshi Sato of the Yukikaze watched with growing frustration as his gunners let loose salvo after salvo, all of it falling wide. These targets weren't in the manual. They weren't moving like destroyers, and they weren't reacting like torpedo boats either. That's because they weren't either of those things. They were something new, and they had trained for this. Walker's boats were operating within what naval planners had started calling the blind zone, a narrow tactical band identified during tests off the Louisiana coast. It was a sweet spot where enemy fire control radar struggled to maintain a lock, but light defensive cannons couldn't quite reach either. The PT boats lived in that space now, untouchable, unpredictable, and deadly. Then came the third destroyer, Shiranui. Just as its crew activated their spotlights and swept them across the waves, the beams landed squarely on PT-224, commanded by Lieutenant Greg Davidson. His forward Bofors had already acquired the target. That spotlight, meant to blind the Americans, instead gave them the clearest shot of the night. Davidson's crew had drilled this scenario over and over, had to use the enemy's own illumination to guide their fire. As soon as the white cone locked onto them, they opened up. The results were devastating. 6 direct hits raked across the Shiranui's bridge and superstructure, disabling its primary fire control system and killing most of the officers stationed on the command deck. Flames rolled across the upper decks, and for a brief, eerie moment, the destroyer seemed to lurch sideways, like a man punched in the ribs. 3 destroyers, 3 targets, 1 night. And suddenly, it was no longer the PT boats being hunted.
Back at the forward command bunker on Crescent Island, Commander Matthew Briggs stared at his receiver in disbelief. The radio updates coming in did not match anything in the traditional naval playbook. He was hearing reports of 4 lightly armored patrol boats going toe-to-toe with 3 Japanese destroyers and winning. Not by luck, not by retreat and pursuit tactics, but by direct firepower and surgical precision. What had started as an experiment had become a revolution. The concealed forward gun systems had not only performed above spec, they had shattered every assumption about how small vessels could be used in naval warfare. The results were more than technological, they were psychological. Japanese crews trained to view PT boats as minor threats were now facing vessels that hit with the force of a cruiser at point-blank range. One Japanese sailor, Yoshio Tanaka, who survived the battle aboard the crippled Hamikaze, later wrote in his journal that it felt like fighting ghosts, ghosts with fire in their hands and thunder in their mouths. The sheer suddenness of the attack, shells flying from boats they believed unarmed, had broken their rhythm. Command chains faltered. Veteran officers hesitated. They had no frame of reference for what was happening. Onboard radios buzzed with desperate calls for coordination, but the tactical picture was deteriorating too fast for normal procedures to matter. Captain Motoyo Katsumi, in charge of the Japanese formation, tried to hold things together over comms, but his ships were being torn apart by an enemy they could barely track, let alone target. American boats, commanded by men who seemed to know every soft spot in the Japanese playbook, were cutting precise angles through the dark waters like they'd choreographed this very dance months in advance. And in a way, they had. Lieutenant Robert Chen, skipper of PT-223, executed a flanking maneuver through the narrow gap between the Yukikaze and Shiranui just as the 2 destroyers shifted position to chase other American targets. Chen's crew had been drilled for this exact moment. As the Yukikaze's stern swung wide during its turn, Chen's gunners unloaded 18 rounds into the ship's engineering compartments. The results were immediate. Steam leaks, flooding in lower decks and a sudden loss in engine power that made evasive maneuvers almost impossible. Meanwhile, incoming Japanese reports painted a picture of complete tactical collapse. The Hamikaze had lost its forward fire control system and had suffered devastating casualties on the bridge. The Shiranui was listing heavily to starboard, taking on water in its forward holds. The Yukikaze, with crippled propulsion, was lagging behind and struggling to maintain formation. None of the destroyers had scored meaningful hits on the elusive PT boats, which continued to fire with unnerving accuracy from unexpected angles. What Captain Katsumi did not know was that the entire American attack plan had been carefully constructed around months of analysis. Naval intelligence had combed through captured Japanese tactical manuals, identifying specific weaknesses in destroyer formations and night combat routines. The boats of Special Operations Group 73 had rehearsed this battle down to the minute. Each boat had a designated firing arc, and every movement had been calculated to exploit the timing gaps in Japanese radar tracking and turret traversal speeds. The element of surprise had been weaponized to devastating effect. Just when it seemed like the Japanese might be regaining composure, the damage control teams aboard Hamikaze managed to restore limited power to the ship's 5-inch guns. Captain Katsumi seized the opportunity. His voice barked through the headset, directing all remaining operational batteries to target PT-221, the lead boat, which by now was clearly orchestrating the attack. 3 shells screamed across the water, crashing down around Commander Walker's vessel. Water exploded in towering geysers along the starboard side, drenching the deck and rattling the hull. For a moment, it looked like the destroyers might claw back momentum. But Walker was not one to break formation. Instead of pulling out, he ordered his boat closer. While shells burst all around them, Chief Morrison's gun crew kept firing. The Swedish Bofors system, designed for sustained bursts, held up even under evasive maneuvers. At full throttle, the PT boat twisted between detonations while continuing to lay down punishing fire. It was a dance of speed and firepower that no Japanese doctrine had prepared for. And it was working. The tight formation of destroyers began to fragment. Each ship turned independently now, trying to escape the rain of 40mm shells. The Shiranui, with her bridge crew wiped out and steering compromised, veered into a wide, uncontrolled arc to starboard. This exposed her entire port side. Lieutenant Tomas Rodriguez, commanding PT-225, seized the opening. His crew had been drilled for this broadside opportunity like this one, and they did not waste a second. 23 direct hits along the waterline crippled the Shiranui. The flooding was rapid and catastrophic. In less than 4 minutes, the ship began listing hard to port, its bow disappearing under the waves. The image of a destroyer sinking under fire from patrol boats would ripple through the Japanese fleet and change the way they approached small craft warfare for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, on the battered Hamikaze, Captain Hiroshi Sato made a call that would save his ship, but confirmed the tactical supremacy of the Americans. Realizing that his destroyers could not counter this new kind of enemy, a fusion of mobility and artillery, he ordered a full retreat. Engines surged, and the Yukikaze turned northwest, fleeing at flank speed. The Japanese evacuation convoy, left unprotected, was abandoned to its fate. The battle, from first contact to enemy withdrawal, lasted exactly 47 minutes. 47 minutes that rewrote naval doctrine. Over the course of just 47 minutes, 12 experimental patrol boats, each equipped with hidden forward-mounted artillery, had done what was thought to be impossible. They had taken on 3 heavily armed Japanese destroyers and left them shattered in their wake. The numbers alone were staggering. The American boats were outgunned 10-1, yet they emerged victorious. The tactical shockwaves rippled far beyond the battlefield. The United States Navy had just proven that small, nimble boats could slug it out with capital warships and win. The Pacific theater would never be the same again. When damage control crews finally surveyed PT-219, the results were sobering. Several Japanese shells had missed the ammunition stores by only a few feet. Multiple compartments had taken on seawater from near misses, and parts of the superstructure were scorched and cracked. But the forward gun remained intact, the crew was alive, and more importantly, they were still in the fight. Back in Tulagi, Commander Harrison Webb read the battle reports with disbelief. Radio transmissions had described what sounded like a myth: 4 lightweight boats holding the line against 3 destroyers. Yet the Bover system had done exactly what they had built it to do. It had changed the very rules of naval engagement. What was even more startling was the Japanese reaction. They had no idea what had just hit them. Survivors from the Japanese ships spoke of being attacked by phantoms with demon guns. One sailor, Yoshio Tanaka, wrote in his private journal that the assault felt like being hunted by ghosts armed with thunder. They had expected the usual harassment from underpowered torpedo boats. What they got was a surgical, overwhelming bombardment from an enemy they did not understand. The surprise was so complete that even the Imperial Navy's top analysts couldn't piece it together. In their post-battle assessments, Japanese officers speculated that American destroyer-class weapons had somehow been mounted on larger variants of PT boats, possibly through extended deck hangars or modified hulls. But they were wrong. They had no idea that the 40mm Swedish Bofors cannons had been cleverly installed beneath collapsible forward decking. No idea that these boats were not only faster and more mobile, but also designed specifically to exploit the blind spots of destroyer fire control systems. This misunderstanding crippled Japanese tactical planning for months. In the weeks following the battle near Vella La Vella, Imperial destroyer captains began avoiding conflict with PT boats altogether. The uncertainty of whether they were facing old torpedo runners or the new Bovers-class killers made every decision fraught with hesitation. The psychological impact rivaled the physical damage. The Japanese could no longer trust their tactical playbook. Admiral Tanaka, having reviewed dozens of confused and panicked after-action reports, admitted that something fundamental had changed in how American patrol boats operated. He instructed his strategy teams to develop new response protocols, ones that assumed heavier guns on enemy boats. But they were shooting in the dark, guessing at capabilities based on rumor and fragments. Meanwhile, the United States Navy was seizing the moment. The success of these 12 boats opened up new mission profiles that planners had never considered before. PT boats could now serve as heavy recon vessels, probing enemy formations and testing their readiness. They could provide artillery support for amphibious landings, racing into shallow waters and blasting dug-in positions with shocking precision. Most importantly, they could challenge Japanese control of sea lanes once considered untouchable. In a short, clipped field report sent from the deck of PT-219, Lieutenant Commander Walker Sullivan summarized the turning point in just one sentence. Enemy response continues to rely on outdated assumptions about our armament. This allows us to dictate terms of engagement with significant advantage. Recommend immediate expansion of the program. Behind those restrained words lay the truth. 12 boats had shifted the balance of naval power in the Pacific. Japanese forces evacuating Kolangara soon did so without a destroyer escort. Without cover, their transport ships became easy targets for American forces. Supply lines were severed, reinforcements were delayed or eliminated entirely. What had once been a bold Imperial advance turned into a slow and chaotic retreat. The Bovers boats had done more than win a skirmish. They had sparked a strategic chain reaction. From Tulagi to Guadalcanal, Japanese destroyer commanders began reporting encounters with heavily armed PT boats that fought like destroyers but vanished like shadows. And it didn't matter that only 12 of these boats were ever built. The myths spread faster than the facts. Now every patrol carried doubt. Every contact brought fear that the next PT boat might not just carry torpedoes, it might bring the fury of a full battery right to their doorstep. Back at Pacific Fleet headquarters, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the same report from Walker Sullivan and nodded once, slowly. There was no debate, no delay. The order was simple: expand the program.